How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Eulier Gonzalez. That's right. So, in today's video, let's take a look at the fixed positioning, which is one of the modes in the positioning layout. So, just to jump straight forward into this model and to make a quick recap of how do I get here is because in order to understand and to speed up truly the development process of any of these web applications so you can be much more effective when a PM or a client asks you to build something, certain features, you can speed that out right now with all of these agents. So you as a software developer, you have become more like a manager, like the orchestrator, right? But again, you need to understand first, is this fundamentals? Second, where all of this come from and how you can keep up updated as this technologies evolve. So for example, in the case of HTML or the CSS, JavaScript, and now with TypeScript, where you want to build scalable applications. And as you progress now and started to build, for example, not only client-side applications or applications that are on the browser, right? Which is very interesting because at the end of the day, it's just a document, the HTML, that is interactive, or as they call is this hypertext media or content. So you not only can see is text, boring text plain, or image, but play videos or listen to music or interact, for example, with data visualizations, right? Or even with the canvas, or even with the worlds created in the 3D. So, for example, with WebLG. So pretty much like games. You can run your own games in the browser, and this is thanks to all the heavy lifting and smart people that, for example, in the case of browsers like Chrome or Firefox or Edge, they now allow you to, as a JavaScript developers, to interact via the OS, which is the responsible for managing hardware resource. So it's up to the browsers to interact with the OS by running this system calls. It's just a way to say, hey, I am the browser. I would like to request access to this resource. OS, can you allow me to do that? And it say, hey, which resource you want to access? Well, the network, for example. And it say, okay, so this is the things that you can do, right? So in the case of building now web applications or an HTTP server and the client here with the web technologies, to interact now with a computer that can fetch that hypertext document, all right, and make it available. So right now we can see things like this. So I can now interact with this content and learn from the author of this course, which is Josh Komewa, a software engineer that previously worked at Khan Academy, one of the first companies to ever use React at scale, and then at Gatsby. So he, based on his experience, is now, create is this series of courses. One of them is this CSS for JavaScript developers, and the other is the joy of React. So right now we are looking, or I am looking, at the CSS for JavaScript, and all of this is just to describe is now these fundamental things that the more you're able to describe that in a very concise way, it'll be better for you since you have all of this sorted out and be precise and consists when it comes to delivery features. For example, again, as I mentioned earlier, to clients and product management and so on. So now, so this is what the browser does. So anytime that you, for example, wants to interact with one of the API that the browser exposed as interface, all right? So I mentioned is just the most common thing as a users that we rely or that we do when we run this kind of, or when we interact with a document, right? So let me read the content of this to understand that, or perhaps looking at some image to be more explicit about that, or listen some audio or watch a video to say, okay, now it makes a lot of sense of whatever I'm learning, or I want to take notes, right? So for example, in this case is, well, learning about CSS, and also then later on look at the source of this, right? Which is in the CSS is the working technical group, and also is the web hypertext applications technology working group. This is a fancy name for a web hypertext application technology group. I think it is. No, it's not. What? Is that what? What? Yeah. Oh my God! Did I forget my mind? Did I lose my mind? Jesus, web. Hypertext application technology working group, exactly. Or the what, WG, right? So the web application or the web hypertext, this is why I emphasize a lot of here, is because at the end of the day, this is the foundation of all of this, right? Applications technology working group. So here is now looking at things like how how the structure of these documents will look like, how now the browser will respond to events, or the model for events, canceling events, or even the done nodes, all right? And things like how do we fetch data, for example, using the Ajax or the Ajax programming, but particularly is the XML HTTP requests, right? Which is, instead of sending documents over the cable, let's gonna send some fragments of that, and do that in an asynchronous way. So while the user is doing something, let's see, reading some content, and in this case, reading this document, all right, or perhaps something more interesting is like when the user is reading, it is balanced in the background. We are fetching, for example, research like a chunk of transactions that the user has done in the past 7 days, right? So this is one of the things that this allows to, which is set a standard for actually how we transfer data between this client and the server. And this is the architecture of how now you can make computers to communicate in this network. So in this network, known as the TCP, which is focuses, instead of trying to control the network, that's gonna create protocols of how this device are going to communicate, the transmission control protocol, right? And this is when you look at things like, hey, in this protocol, so you have now an internal representation of different fields, and one of them is the socket, at which port in your house, you are going to allow to receive or even get out of your house, right? Or in the case of computers, is that this is the window or the door that allows to get into, or that allows to receive or send data or package, right? But if this is the house, this is the computer, how do you know where you have to send this piece of data? That's where we have now the IP. And this protocol has evolved to at least using is the IPv4, and then now is the current state at IPv6, because now not only at the beginning you have is static computers, right, static machines that at the origin of this network, which was ARPA, and ARPA was built by as a response by Eisenhower presidency in 1956 that the Russians launched a Sputnik, and that caused us a surprise to Eisenhower, but not to some of the military branch, that they have this set of contract with different parties. So ARPA born out of this necessity, right? And how they can now, not only at the beginning in the ARPA, which was to detect nuclear activities, and this is, for example, the field of geology and seismology, among others. Actually, it come up here, it evolves. But also is these convenient things that these particularly people were doing back in this university. And you can take a look at that when you see, for example, universities like the Texas and the MIT and Iowa, also from the DC. So all of these different universities that they now have this technology, which is say, hey, how do we now transfer data, and how do we can control and command those devices at a distance, right? So this is the emerge of the ARPANET, and then now the reason why, for example, people like Vincent Cerf and Bob Kemp actually come up with this particular protocol to say, hey, in order to send this data here, well, it makes much more sense to focus on the protocol, right? So that's like a huge overview of how do we get here, and why I'm actually exploring this kind of course is to make sense of all of this. So with these standards, right? That in our case, you look at this, one of those standards as well is that we have our hypertext documents. We want to make it look pretty, okay, and also interactive. So in the case of styling this document, we have now the CSS. So because this has evolved over time, and there is a debate of people around that say, no, CSS is not a language. I don't care. I don't get into those debates. You know, it's like, this is what it is. This is what allows to, and let me see how can I use this tool to leverage is when it comes to build something, right? For a client. So in the case of CSS, because the way or the foundation of the CSS is that you can now is add rules of how this document will gonna look like externally, or even inside of the HTML document as a style, or even as a HTML element, right? So when you can now select elements to provide rules of how you're gonna look like, this is what we look at the anatomy of the CSS, and also is, well, how you can select these different nodes in these documents, right? Whether it's by a tag, or it is ID, or it is attributes mainly, or even by class, which is one of the common one. In each one of those elements, they might have, or some of them might have is a, or sorry, some of them has is a particular state where they can be. So for example, if you have now an input, you can now have in a focus state. So this is indicated to the user, hey, you are here, right? Similar for the buttons, where you can say, hey, you press this button, all right? Another example is for the placeholder, is that, hey, this is like an example of how you can or what are these input allows to get in or access or receive. And this is just to describe is like the most common ones, right? Known as the pseudo classes. You can also, for example, now add is elements for decoration purpose, like the pseudo elements, right? You can even target those states where those HTML nodes can be, this visual state. Also, the elements that you can add to these HTML nodes, and some of the niceties of using CSS, like this function that come up, like, hey, I want to calculate is this different unit values, or I do need sometimes is to get the cramp, all right? Or in other words, like, hey, this is the value that you're gonna use when certain threshold happens. This is the color that I wanna use. That I wanna use. And I'm going to later on explain some other of these functions. The other is behaviors that CSS can do, right? So for example, how this document will gonna look like based on a specific viewport, or, well, how this document will going to apply, or what are the rules that this document is gonna apply based on a particular layer. How these specific elements will behave when an animation happens, and what is the timeline for. And I just barely scratching the surface, and because this is the basic stuff that we need to understand, as well as the box model. Some people I'm going to mention that later. But it's the foundations here, and what is relevant at 2026 is, well, you need to understand is the CSS rules, the anatomy of that, some of the basic behaviors like the media query, why this is still relevant and useful, some selectors that are still needed despite the web development era, right, or state. So for example, if I select a class or by an ID, and also know that you can select those elements based on a state HTML nodes, right? Like pseudo classes, like hover or focus, or hover or focus, or like hover or focus, or also is based on the location of his element, right? If this is the first child, or this is the first end of type, first or last end of type, or last end of child. And so with that, all right, and then also I went through look at the color formats. So what are the most common formats, like keywords or hexadecimal, RGB and HSL, and now we have is the OLAC as well. the units that we manage here, pixel, percentage, and root elements, we most of the time in their use cases, so root element, we use that for fonts. Pixel is when you need to position elements as a layout, or the percentage when you want is to now inherit values from. So the other is know the typography, which is this set of family, which is how this text was going to look like. So whether it's serif or sans serif. So this kind of context right now, as you can see, is sans serif because it's explicitly for to be read. All right. You can also add some serif fonts here, right? By saying, hey, this is now the font. And here the one to do is this. That's interesting. Style here. Oh, you're stuck, bro. That's interesting. Okay. And then I want to say is that, hey, the font style or the font style, right? The font style will be interesting. The font family, right? I wanna use now is, for example, is something like this, a cursive. Let me see if it exactly serif, for example, or sans serif. You know, so sans serif has this nice little things here, this decorations that applies to the text as a way to provide some, as a way to branding something, right? And speaking of branding, this is why we have now the web fonts to say, well, this is this set of characters that allow us is to express the ideas or the web apps aligned to the branding. So this sans serif web fonts and the families or the type of font that you can have here, the variety of this, whether it's regular or bold or italic, each one of them also have is this different or applications. So regular, pretty straightforward, nothing fancy too, but for, let me put it where it was, right? But for content that you want to make this important, well, you use now things like the bold, right? Or anytime that you want to describe something that is like a foreign language, or a thought of the author, right? Like this in this case, right? Or any scientific terms, or any TV series, books, stuff like that, you use now this. And again, this is something that indicating as you're reading content is like, hey, in this case, this is something that the author think about that. So this is one of the things that I really love about going into these explorations, okay? At least for my understanding. So we have now the typography, and also is the things, the operation that you can do with typography. I can align that typography. I can add some space at the beginning of the letter spacing, or letter line height, or letter spacing. Okay, or where this text will gonna look like. And this is just the fundamental plus the things that are still relevant in 2026. Okay, so with that, and in order to understand also how do we get here in this in the current web development, browsers at the beginning they don't have any conventions to implement how this element we're gonna look like. Designers have to figure it out that the hard way, and they create now a set of rules known as the CSS reset to make all of the browsers, no matter who you are and who user from which computer you are trying to access to the browser and showing the content, right? Well, I need you to have in this blank state or in this common ground. So that's what CSS actually do at the beginning. So now things like alignments or colors or how this box will gonna look like. So all of these browsers now are on the same page. So but as the year progress, all right, we rely less and less in this kind of CSS reset. However, there's still some nuances, for example, in certain elements, especially elements that are still now adding more features in a way that browsers can keep up with the pace. Most of the time with inputs, right? So input text is one of them. But I also looked at there are certain properties that you can now pass down to these nested elements here, or known as the inheritance. So for most of the times they are text or color based, all right? And also you can pass down those values is when you're using a percentage to describe the dimension of these elements. So because if you want to apply now certain rules with the same name, well, it is useful for us to know how those competing CSS will going to resolve. So if you come from the JavaScript environment or developing software applications, you know that if you put now the same name in that scope, depending of which identifier you're using, let or cons, let it won't allow you to redeclare that. Not to mention cons, it won't allow you to mutate the value. It's gonna throw you now an error. But in the case of CSS, it won't do that. In fact, it's going to behave pretty much like if you're merging objects or like interface work in TypeScript. So, but in any case, so here, when we look at this competing CSS or this CSS rule names with the same name, it's going to now pass through this cascading effect. This is not quite relevant in 2026. It is important to understand that this is something that happened. All right. So what is important to understand, right, is that when you are now writing applications or describing documents here, the way of how those users read the content matters. And this is why now these documents that at the beginning it started as on the US states, but now it scaled to other cultures. So for example, Middle East, that's soon or later they were gonna be called now West Asia, yeah. And then for example, hands-based characters like the Chinese or Japanese, Korean, Thailand, Laos, all that kind of stuff. So is this, right? And in order to describe how this content is going to be read, initially we use now the position of this content, right? So whether it's a block or the inline. Inline is go to the when you read the content, and the block goes with the how all of this content is stacked to each other. So because now the web is now worldwide, they need to find a way to describe the content not based on its position, but based on the logical reading. This is why now we have in the block or inline, we also describe is things like star or n, right? To describe whatever the reading mode or the writing mode that the document is. Well, you want is to do this kind of, this is how you want to display this content. And this is how you are going to provide is dimension to all of these elements. And it's speaking of dimension, which is how all of these elements we're gonna look like as a box. This is also following is the spec from the CSS, which describe is how all of these different elements we're gonna look like when they and by elements I mean is the HTML elements, input, section, so paragraph, navbar, footers, articles, select, radio, checkboxes, how all of these are going to look like when you show them on print media or a visual media. And the algorithm is that they're going to look like as a box, right? So this box that has an anatomy, all right? So you have now the content, you have the padding, the border, and the margin, okay? And each one of them has its special nuance. So once you understand the stepping stone of this, so then you can now look at the different layouts here. So layouts, which are the way of how all of these different boxes are going to sort it out, right? And that is, well, you have now the OG layout, the normal flow. You also have now new layout. So CSS pretty much is like a mini, it's like a mini language where it has its own specific layer, where it describes how all of these boxes will going to interact to each other. So at the beginning, we also have is the normal flow or the OG layer, right? So it wasn't intended to just describing is the writing mode or how the content is going to be read, but not to describe layout, you know? So this flow layer, which is made of the block, inline, and inline block, the behavior of each one of those is that, well, block is going to take all the available horizontal space. It is greedy, right? You can modify its dimensions. And the other is the inline block, which is take only the small, the width possible, only the remaining, the smallest width possible. So you don't want to make any fuss. It's like it is like you have a guest party and they sit where they needs to be, right? And the great thing is that it can line break the content to whatever is holding. You can modify its dimension, and that's where we have now the inline block. So sometimes you need to have an element that behave like an inline element to fit that in that width, but you can modify its dimension here. And this is just to describe is the anatomy of this OG layout, and then some specific nuance that happen in this layout. For example, like margin collapse. There is a set of rules that's going on in there. I don't want to get into the weeds into that. The most common thing is that, hey, the bigger margin. So the idea of margin collapse is that you in margin that have the same. So margins share the same space. Yeah. So margins are going to or when you have boxes, their margins is going to collapse into one single space. Right, that's the whole point of margin collapse. So because of it has several use cases. one of them is that what happened when the margin is overlapping with another, so the bigger margin wins. What happened when you have now elements with a lot of margins? So the margin is going to stack in this context. So this is just the model 1. And now here in the model 2, which is describing is the rendering logic, well, is that so far we have looked at how all of these elements are nicely put it next to each other in an orderly fashion. But sometimes you need elements to be outside of the normal flow, to move or to overlap over another content. In those cases, those elements you can open in using the positional layout, and you have several modes. You have now the relative, the position, the relative, the absolute, the fixed, which is something that I'm gonna look into the video, and the sticky here, right? So this is great, all right, because now that we know that this exists, right? This positioning layout that allows to these particular elements, so we can describe where these elements we're gonna live here in the viewport, all right? So anytime that you opt into this, two things happen. First, it allows you to access through certain property, like top, right, bottom, and left, and it set constraints to those children's elements. In the case of the relative, right, because here, when you try to compare that with the normal flow using, for example, like margins, right, the thing is that now these elements are out of the flow, right? In the case of the relative position, is that the big difference is that position doesn't impact layout. When we apply margin to an element, it can affect many other elements. Exactly. So positioning doesn't impact layout. So because now it is on a different stacking context. Again, something that I'm gonna describe also in today's video. So this is it, right? This is the big difference. So the big difference is that the position doesn't impact layout, right? Unlike margin, it in fact, well, promote that element on top of that, right? You can also use now positioning here to say, hey, I do wanna, again, this is describing as the positioning behaviors here. You can using now positioning here to say, hey, I want to this element that is going to follow the normal flow to move on top of that. So when you open into the relative, right, particularly, it's gonna follow the normal flow from the OG layer, right? But you can modify its position here. So far so good, right? But sometimes you want elements to now are on or to now show on top of another, right? So you exactly, so you want it on top of another. So for example, you are elements like models or any floating elements, which is right now there's a lot of elements with that sits on the right screen to show you is now chat applications or show you a chat dialog box, stuff like that. So the decorative elements as well when you want to create perhaps some particular effects, okay? And for those reasons, well, we use now the absolute position here. Again, as I mentioned before, anytime that you opt into this positioning layouts, two things happen. That element can have access to the properties, additional properties, and it modified or it set constraints to this element, right, on how it behave, how it's going to interact with each other. In the case of relative position, it's going to maintain it is orderly fashion from the from where it was defined in the document, right? And follow is the normal flow. But in the case of absolute positioning, so certain things happen, or there's some couple questions. So where these elements now is located, or the placement based on this frame. When you don't describe where this element is going to live by modifying is the positioning attributes, okay, is going to now put it at the top left or at the origin of the elements that contains it, okay. And you might wonder, what are the elements that contains it? Okay, well, as you can see here, you know, the elements that it contains here. Okay. So yeah, is that where do these elements we're gonna look like, right? If I put it here, right? So if you opt into or if you use the positioning properties, well, it's going to now put the elements given those instructions here, the top and left. But again, a question is that where these elements live and how these elements know where to locate it, which is what is the default place where this element is going to live. And that's a good question, because when you don't provide any positioning properties, right, it's going to look, or it's going to anchor at the closest, particularly in the absolute pointing, is going to anchor to the closest relative elements. So in this case, when we add this, for example, p text, right, like the hello world, what it's doing is to say, hey, by default, my closest relative element is now this p text, right? What is it's box, this one, exactly, is this one. So by default, if I don't say something like this, it's gonna put now, what do you think will happen if I remove that? Well, again, the algorithm that is asking for the place where this absolute element we're gonna live, it say, let me look now at the closest positioning element, right? And if it's not, I'm gonna look at the root, and by default, the relative elements or the root element is the HTML, which when I remove, it's gonna put that the top here, right? And as you can see, is here. It's interesting because now it's modifying the layout, right? Or no, it's not modifying the layout. Okay, it's not modifying the layout. This is the btext. Exactly, it's not modifying the layout. So if I remove this, for example, right? Now that box appears where it needs to be. So if I say something like this, right? So to prevent any layout, you know, it appears where it needs to. And that's quite interesting because and it's interesting that these elements appear is here, right? So somehow that element is rendering in this fashion. So if I reload this, right? So by default, the absolute positioning now sits in the flow position, all right? If you don't provide anything. But if you now opt into that, then it's going to look now at the closest absolute or relative element here. Effects on layout. This point is a bit less obvious, but maybe even more important. When we set something to the positioning absolute, we pull it out of the flow. When the browser is laying out elements, it effectively pretends that absolute positioning element don't exist. They are incorporeal. You can stick your hand right through them like a holograms or a ghost. Okay, another behavior when you opt into absolute positioning. So you're pulling elements out of the flow. So they behave like this incorporeal or this incorporeal or this incorporeal or or these holograms here. So when you put all of these elements on top of that only with absolute positioning here, you see that effect, that hologram effect. Again, this is in terms of it is content, but in the time of the background, okay, exactly. So the order here also matters here. And then you have now these things called collapsing patterns. While often the ability to take an element out of the flow is useful, there are times where it can be annoying. Consider this example. It's that the ability to take elements out of the flow is useful. There are times that it can be annoying here. And in this case, it is because despite that we opt into this positioning, despite that we opt into these elements to be absolute, and I want to give is the dimension of this. In this example, we have a pink box sitting like this, right? And when we toggle on the position absolute, you notice that the parent collapse, right? Not only exactly the parent collapse. So that is apex on the. So what does it happen? Well, in terms of the flow layer, the pattern is empty. Remember, absolute elements are like holograms. right? So they're break the flow. Okay, they're out of the flow. Yeah, they're out of the flow. We pull it out of the flow. So that means that the pattern collapse. It won't take the elements here, but if you up into a relative, it's going to now, it won't collapse, right? So these elements now behave like the flow layout, right? It's part of the flow. Why is this? Because positioning elements relative by default, they are now they're follow the flow, the normal flow. All right. The same for absolute positioning here. Absolute positioning here. When you don't provide any dimension, right? And you provide some contents to that. Hello, you know? But in this case, right? Because these elements now are, because this is an absolute element, right? In this case, okay. Yeah, because this is because this is an absolute element. And when it comes to the layouts or effects on layout, that's why it look in this. The effects on layouts is that these elements are pulled out of the flow. If you put several of them, the last absolute elements will win. And if you now use that on a pattern that you don't define that as relative, so for example, let's say position relative, okay, right, the pattern won't collapse, or the pattern the pattern won't wrap the nested childrens here. So because of this behavior of the absolute relative, is like, hey, how can I make to this happen? And in this case, there are some. So the thing is that sometimes you might want to have this, all right, to actually, but using is a position, absolute position. So in those cases, it's like, so you need to realize another layer here. And again, because absolute layouts are pulling elements out of the flow, the effects on layer is that it's like hologram, all right? They're putting on top of that. And the patterns will collapse. It is, or the pattern will collapse if you define a child node into this. And then you are working now with absolute values. And very interesting things is that how, at the end of the day, is how this absolute positioning works. Okay, so that's good. That's great. All right. So I look at what happened when we up into the positioning layout, particularly with the or the different modes, and where the relative. So how the relative behave, or when you up into from the scratch, you have now this positioning layout, all right? Part of the rendering logic too, the positioning layout. So wherever you up into this layout, right, by using the positions, you are now triggering two things. First, you can have access to additional properties, positioning properties, and the and how these elements we're gonna behave. Set constraints to the child elements, right? In the case of relative, this is pretty much behave by default like elements in the flow layout, right? You can now, and this is one of the important things of the relative, is pull it won't affect the layout, right? Unlike, for example, margins, where it's going to modify the layout when you use the positioning relative on this element, it won't. And you can also do some nice little things, like putting elements or to describe some specific notations of that. So that's great for absolute positioning. So far, so good. And then we look at the absolute positioning is, well, how these elements, or why do we even need to have this? For models, or any content that you want to now show on top of that, for example, some for decorations. And a good example of that is the GTA 5 website. When they use that, say GTA 5 for, right? GTA, I think is 6, right? Let me put it this way. Exactly. GTA, this one, right? You know, it put this element here. And this is very interesting in terms of the ability that this document, because at the end of the day, this is a document, hypertext media, that it allows us to browse this document, right? And then starting to now creating this effect, this interactivity here, right? This is a very nice effect here of how they achieve this, right? Where is it come from? Coming November 19, 2026. Okay. On Vice City, right? And all of this. And remember, at the end of the day, this is all of this image here. This is rendering image. As you scroll down, you know, all of those are image. All of those are image. All of these are image. All of these are image, right? So now it allows you to browse this content, and again, all of these are image. All of these are image. You know how beautiful it is to experience this. And again, all of this is a document. This is a document. Try to imagine this reading the Bible, bro. Or reading any other sacred dogs, the Quran, or any other book, right? With this kind of interactivity here, right? And then again, it follows this sequence, right? And then it follows another sequence here, and all of this are now is image, and all of these models are generated 3D generations, right? And you look at this, the same for this. This is another image. As I scroll down, as I interact with this application, I can see this kind of stuff. The only thing that matters, and it's gonna show this kind of content. Stay that, and then now it allows you to scroll down in this particular way, right? And the thing, and well, it's describing the entire narrative here, the entire history here, right? Again, a bunch of image here, I'm scrolling down here, and look at that, right? Right? And again, exploring is all of this, it's exploring all of this, and again, all of these are image as I scroll here. Remember, all of this, at the end of the day, this is a document, and hypertext document, bro. I really love this kind of effects here that they achieve here. Right, at the end of the day, they just image, just rendering with new stage, right? Um, the same for this. Exactly. This is a new interaction here. Like that, you know. Exactly. So you know is, and again, describing is another story here. You know, but all of this is based on, well, the reality. Right? Experience counts. Confident charms and cunning. Roles and seasoning bank robber. For talent, ready to take the risk that bring the biggest reward. So again, it's showing all of this. And well, as you can see, is this, right? So, but again, this is some, and then you're starting to realize the pattern here, you know, of all of this, and how they describe this particular story here, and how all of these elements is going to overlap, and how all of these elements interact with each other. And I really love this kind of exercise here, because especially with absolute position, is that how all of these elements now move from one place to another. You are playing a lot of with this layout here. So that's great, right? So in the case of absolute positioning, when you open it, right? Again, it allows you to use these additional positioning properties and the and set constraints to that. So for example, you started to ask questions. Where this element is gonna live? If I just use only the positioning absolute, where these elements will live, all right? Well, these elements by default is gonna behave like a normal flow, right? But if you starting to use now the additional property that it comes from, okay, then the behaviors change, because it's not going to follow because it's not going to follow the normal flow. Now it's going to look at what is the containing block, or the element that has is the positioning relative, the padding ancestor on that, right? And how now the absolute positioning affects the layout, particularly here, right? So all of these elements is now like holograph. They putting on top of another one, right? And they modify or they collapse the parents unless that parents up into this positioning layer. So that's great, right? So that's great. There's some also centering tricks here with the absolute positioning, and I do find that's very, very, very interesting in terms of saying if I want to center an element on a positioning layout, right, I do need to indicate what is the position where this element is going to live, right? In the container, in this case, I can say, hey, the container here will be now 300, 300, right? And here I can say all of this property called as the inset, all right? The inset property. The centering trick requires within setting all the edge properties to the same value. And this feels very tedious, and model CSS is giving us more tasks to have accomplished. How all of this, what is the value of all of this position? So we have now the inset here. So the idea here is that put this box in the 0 position of the top, right, bottom, and left, which can be quite contradictory. It's like the algorithm is trying to put that elements in those places, but you can. But what you can here is to define is the dimension of that box. All right. And because this box, in order to center elements here, you can say, take all the available space from the left and from the left, from the left and from the right, and put these elements there. So not only from the left and right, but in the case of absolute positioning, take all the available space from the 4 directions, or the 4 positions here: top, right, bottom, and left. And this is why it actually works. But again, this is because these elements that opt into the position layout, it is contained by an element that defines the layer. So for example, if I say, hey, let me put 100% and 100% here, yeah, exactly. But if I don't set that, it say, hey, it put that at the top. You may wonder, that's interesting. Why this element is putting at day? Well, remember that at the end of the day, this element is rendered on the origin here, and well, it's actually rendered in the proper position here. So the height and the width, which are algorithms that are calculated by default in the case of width, by taking all the available horizontal space that the child has, all right, in this case, is working with this. But the high algorithm doesn't work that way. The high algorithm is going to take the small space, or the minimal space, as possible. However, we can have now locally can have properties that allows to take is the small view height, which is, hey, take all the small view height here, and now that actually work as expected, right? You can also say view height. What the French does? It collapsed. Okay. What? It collapsed. Like what? Ah, there you got it. Exactly. So this is the restore, right? And this is interesting here. This is just this particular box, but I do have this behind here, right? So as you can see, it's a, hey, but it's taking more available space here. How can I actually guarantee that element is not scrollable? You know, you don't modify that. Well, what you can say is just remove the container, or instead of removing the container, just comment that out, right? Here, just comment that out. And yeah, just comment that out here, right? And now this box will behave as expected, right? It say, hey, what is the dimension of this box? And it say, well, the dimension of this box, which is the content here, that's interesting. So if I say, for example, margin to know where this box is, the box size of this, if I say border border 1 pixel black, exact border is 1 pixel black and solid. I think it is. You have to say solid 1 pixel. There, you got it here, right? So what this is telling me here is that with the absolute positioning, especially when you provide now the width here, you are now targeting is the content here. So if I say something like this, and then I say, hey, the box model, in this case, the box container, I think it is the box container. What is this? Let me see if this actually work. This particular example here. If I say is this, to say the box sizing exactly is now the content or the border. You see how the things actually change quite a bit. But again, the whole point of this, right? Even if I add now padding, right? If I add some padding to this, right? This is actually describing is this, right? So as you can see now, in this, so what am I doing here? What am I trying to describe here is the box, right? So how now this box is at the end of the day. So because each element at the end, they are now boxes here. But here I am saying is this box will open into the positioning layout, specifically the absolute. And this is the dimensions of this box. Again, the content, the padding, and the border, right? This is what it is. The content, the padding, and the border, right? And with that, so I define is the dimension of this box, okay? And how it's going to look like, how in this case the content there, how it's going to render that. So if I try to add now content to that, if I say hello world, it's going to add that on top of that, right? And that's pretty interesting here, because now this is how you can centering elements in the absolute position here by using is the inset. So you're telling the browser, hey, these elements, I want you to put them all in the origin, all right, of the top and right and left and bottom, which is kind of like impossible situations to put these elements here and here and here and here. But he's figuring out that when you tell that and you pass the position and you combine that with margin, right? It's a take all the available horizontal space. You can say something like this: take all the available horizontal or margin horizontal space. So for example, margin block, right? It's going to start to use that auto, okay? And then it's going to center on the block directions, but that's not what I want to. I want to center horizontally. So you can say margin inline, and now the elements here is centered there. But if you want to center center horizontally and vertically, so now it'll work as expected. So that's pretty interesting, pretty neat to recap about this. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.